to try to give some kind of a picture, a global picture, of how the Shoah shapes contemporary Jewish identity in different places. We have 5 very important people sitting with us here this morning. I'd like to point out you do not see Malcolm Holine here. He could not be with us. Therefore, I've asked Professor Stephen Katz. He has American Jewry on his shoulders this morning and will represent the American Jewish community. I'm going to give a very short introduction to all of our guests, and then we have 3 questions that we have prepared that I'm going to ask, and each one in succession will give a short answer, his thoughts, his feelings, that relate to the places that they're coming from. Professor Stephen Katz holds a Slater Chair in Jewish and Holocaust Studies at Boston University and is the former director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 1972. He's the academic advisor to the chair of 31 countries who belong to the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and a member and founder and co-chair of the Academic Committee of the USHMM and chair for Holocaust Commission of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. And he will represent on this panel the United States. Vic Aldeff. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies in Sydney, Australia. He was previously appointed by the state government as the chairperson of the New South Wales Community Relations Commission. Vic represents the community in the media and speaks widely on racism and the Holocaust. He was born in Zimbabwe, but his family is from the Greek island of Rhodes. His grandparents and 151 other family members were murdered in the Holocaust. Our third participant, and of course he representing the Jewish community of Australia, Rabbi Marcelo Polyakov. Rabbi Marcelo Polyakov was born in Buenos Aires in 1966. Since 2002, he has served the Rabbi de Central Union Israelita Cordova in Argentina. Rabbi Polyakov has a BA in International Affairs, an MA in Judaic Studies. He's a graduate of the Senior Educators Program at the University of Jerusalem and an advisor of the INADI, the National Institute Against Discrimination in Argentina. Currently, he is the president of the Latin American Rabbinical Assembly and director of the Interreligious Dialogue Department, Latin American Jewish Congress. And of course, you're representing Argentina and Latin America. All of Latin America is on your shoulders. Rabbi Baruch Goren, born in 1973 in Odessa. In 1989, he graduated from the School of Young Journalists. From 90 to 94, Rabbi Goren studied yeshiva in Moscow. In 1991, he founded and headed the Jewish interest magazine, L'Chaim, as well as a publishing company under the same name. In 1999, Rabbi Goren has headed the Public Relations Department of the Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia. Since 2012, he served as the chairman of the board of the Jewish Museum and Center of Tolerance. And of course, Russian Jewry is on your shoulders this morning. Patrick Petit Ochayon, a teacher of Jewish theology, and holds a degree from Bet Hamidosh Morim, which he completed at Etz Chaim Yeshiva in Switzerland. Specialization is biblical and Jewish studies. Petit Ochayon is a pedagogue, a trainer of teachers, speaker, and director of the magazine Hamaway. He is currently director of education for the Jewish National Social Fund, the training organization for professionals, elite, volunteers of associations of the Jewish community, and responsible for the network of Jewish schools in France. And France is on your shoulders this morning as well. The first question, I need the questions also. First question posing to all of our panelists is a big one. What is the greatest challenge we face today as Jews in the modern world. Professor Katz.
Thank you, Ephraim. All of you have heard this morning Professor Del Pergola, one of the world's greatest Jewish demographer, and I think he made it very plain that the primary issue is an internal issue, or an internal-external issue having to do with Jewish demography. In the United States, we have had, until recently, the largest Jewish community in the world, and also the most successful Jewish community that the world has ever seen. The highest income rate per capita, the highest education rate, 90% of our children go to university, young women go to school at the same rate as men, into the graduate schools in medicine and law. We have major libraries. But the community, as the Pew study and earlier studies show, is actually declining, and declining significantly. On the one hand, as Sergio said, we have 72% rate of intermarriage among the non-traditional. And on the other hand, which he didn't mention, we have very low birth rates, which is obviously important. If you're losing people at the top end, if you can replace them at the bottom. So it's important that we try to address the issue of birth rates. Perhaps orgies would be more valuable than conventions. So the fact is, that this is Ephraim's suggestion. So this, I think, is something we need to pay very close attention to. We have to do everything we can to encourage young families to have children. So, for example, you hear all kinds of arguments. I don't think they're really valid, but about school tuitions, about having numerous children and not being able to afford Jewish camps, university tuitions. We also have the problem in America of state religious divides, so the state doesn't help the day schools. So there are a lot of issues we have to work on with regard to population. And I would say that all the other things fall far beyond, below in importance. As to the external threat, my good friend Irvin Cutler gave a brilliant talk on anti-Semitism and the new anti-Semitism. Obviously, fundamentalism from the Muslim community is a threat, and it's not only a threat in London and Paris, it's increasingly a threat in America. And of course, it is focused, as Erwin pointed out, on Israel, which is now the largest Jewish community. All politics aside, the fact is the Jewish people are now increasingly clustered in the land of Israel. Most Jewish births occur in the land of Israel, and therefore the land of Israel, the Medina, is our central consideration. And I would say that those are the internal and external considerations from an American point of view.
Thank you. My remarks follow from Professor Katz. The issue which I have identified as the greatest challenge is the greatest challenge which has confronted Jewish people for 2,000 years, and that is assimilation. We have always assimilated. I came across the minutes of the community of Newport, Rhode Island from 1815, 200 years ago. And what did they identify as the major issues facing them? Anti-Semitism, relations with other communities, and assimilation. The key now is how we recalibrate and adapt to a changing landscape. A changing landscape in which we have fewer Holocaust survivors. The Holocaust is already in the distant past. Israel is taken for granted. The word apartheid is automatically associated with Israel, and an economic situation where up-and-coming generations have to cope with global prosperity, which makes making the living more difficult. Part of the new context in which we found ourselves is that just a few years ago, there were quotas and bans against Jews being part of civil society, whether it was in courts or country clubs. Today, in my own country, Australia, we have a country where we have had 2 Jewish heads of state, a Jewish head of the Defense Force, Jewish head of the army, Jewish Supreme Court judge, university schools named after Jewish leaders, and at the same time, the 3 wealthiest people in the country are Jewish. It is a country in which Jewish people are deeply integrated into civil society. On the other hand, we are a deeply Zionistic and Holocaust-aware community. We have the highest percentage of Holocaust survivors anywhere in the world. Our fundraising for Kirin Aisor is in some years the highest per capita, and over 50% of our kids go to Jewish schools. So the key is to balance integration with identification and remaining committed and part of the community. So how are we doing that from the Australian experience? We are, to use a sporting expression, playing what's in front of us. So we are introducing, as we speak, new programs all the time. And just very quickly, to give you a couple of them. We have introduced a program called Y2I, which stands for Youth to Israel, where every single Jewish child from the age of 15, at the age of 15, will receive a check for between $5,000 and $10,000 to take part in an Israel program. We have introduced an observership program where young adults are invited into community organizational boards so they can see the community at work close up, develop an appreciation of what is really happening in the community, and ideally join some of those boards, which has been the case. We have developed a program called ASAP, Anti-Semitism Action Program, where funding has been raised from wealthy members of the community, specifically to target anti-Semitism, to take our advocacy work to a new level. And the last example I will give is we have formed a group called the Giving Forum, where the 24 or so wealthiest members of the community have identified where they, in consultation with the community leadership, where they see the most effective use of their funds can be. So we have created new community leadership positions, e.g., one is to politicize the entire community, ideally. So in other words, to encourage up-and-coming members of the community to join political branches, whether it's the Greens, Labour, Conservative, whatever party it is, to get involved, to stand for office, and to train people in how to do that. At the same time, we are engaging more strategically with our friends in the Chinese, Greek, Indian, Hindu, Vietnamese community. Again, to get them mobilized and to form alliances and not just social bridges with the Jewish community. So the key is balancing integration into civil society, which is important, and not losing ourselves because the line between integration and assimilation is blurred and no one announces when they are disappearing. Balancing that integration with commitment and identification with the community, but doing so in a way which remains relevant to up-and-coming generations.
Thank you, Vic. Rabbi Marcelo, Politico.
It's difficult for me to add something original, so I thought that I could bring some Torah here, more Torah. And I can understand, at least as far as I can, that the main challenges for our region, and maybe as I see for the whole Jewish world, are related to the three sons of Noah. Remember, they were Yafet, Ham, and Shem. Well, because I see the Yafet line, which, as you should know, that's linked to Greek culture. Now here at the days of Hanukkah, it's very connected to us. There are some of our main guys from our communities that look for relevance in the beauty of the external world. I mean external world outside of the Jewish community. So they look for Yafet and they assimilate. The other trend that I see as dangerous as this one is the trend that I link it with Ham, which, as you already know also, it's the guy that was linked to the rage, to the violence, and to extremism. And I see that there is a danger growing a lot on the side of our own extremists that are beginning to be also violent inside our people. And between those extremes, we are the Shem, right? We are the middle path. And we are losing some relevance because we lack some of the 2 points that I mentioned before. I mean, we should add some passion, not in the way of harm, but we should add some passion to our Jewish life, and also we have to add some beauty to this life in order to grow inside our own Jewish community. All this, I think, is connected to another problem, which I would say it's our danger of trying to grasp the whole. Even the fanatics or the assimilated people try to find the relevance and the essence in the wholeness, in the completeness. And when you cherish the idea of totality, that's danger. Because if we remember the first two brothers, Cain and Abel, the main problem of them was, as far as I see, that Cain wouldn't give up his completeness. I mean, being a brother means that you have just a part of totality. And also the extremists, and also the one who goes away searching in the assimilation the totality, I think that in those extremes we are lacking the love of being a brother, and we are lacking the nice thing of cherishing the part. And that goes and leads to this membership, or this memberment. And I see in those trends real dangers.
Thank you, Rabbi Goy.
Thank you. First of all, meaning that the kvetch is our popular genre, so to say for Russian Jew what is the biggest threat is not so simple task, because we see every threat as the greatest threat. So I'll not be too original, because the assimilation is for sure the biggest threat for the diaspora Jews. And I was born in one country and I grew in another country without moving from that. I was born in the Soviet Union, that people still had remembered the threat of real physical determination. And even in the 70s, they knew that every day something like that can happen. So now we live in a totally different country, and so the threat of the challenge of the physical determination is not so close for us today, but we see that the numbers of the Jews that are affiliated with the community is increasing in the great numbers, because the statistics from zero every time is good. So you have now the tens of thousands of Jews that are affiliated to the community, so also. And still, after you have the numbers, you have a few thousand kids in the Jewish schools in Moscow. But you know there are other hundreds of thousands of the kids that are not going to the schools. So it's not hard to understand that the choice is very simple. Either they will go to Israel and will remain Jews, either their children for sure will not be Jews. It's not only in the talks of the intermarriage and so on, but also in their identity, their Jewish identity. So I believe that the biggest threat is the assimilation, but it's not the only one. The different threat is split between the Jews, and I see in that the future challenge. We are now can see the evidence of the biggest split between the American Jewish diaspora and Israel that ever was in the modern times, and I am sure that it will go deeper. So, how the Jewish people will not be split for the two peoples, and how the Jewish diaspora will remain the diaspora without moving to Israel. Because it's that the matter of fact that not all of us will move to Israel. And that's the biggest question of our future. So if we'll we can take the position not only of the threats but also of the decisions. That's the two very understandable goals. Try to prevent the assimilation. That's the work of the Jewish communities last a couple of thousands of years, and try to increase into the bond between the Jewish community in diaspora and the Jewish people in Israel. That's the only chance us to remain the one unique people.
Thank you, Rabbi Goren. Patrick is going to speak in French. If you don't understand, put on your headphones and you'll get the translation to English. Or Russian or French or Spanish.
Merci. Je pense que je vais prendre le problème dans un autre sens, parce que on vit aussi en France cette problématique par rapport à l'antisémitisme, quelle que soit sa source ou son expression. Et cet antisémitisme provoque dans son réveil deux attitudes qui sont largement opposées. Une attitude ramène le juif à son identité, parce que d'un seul coup, en se trouvant remis en cause par l'antisémite en tant que juif, il a envie de savoir ce que ça veut dire être juif. Et beaucoup de jeunes qui sont loin de l'identité juive, loin de la connaissance, se rapprochent de la communauté, de l'école juive, pour savoir qui ils sont. D'un autre sens, complètement différent, on a des gens qui ressentent le besoin de s'éloigner de la communauté parce que d'un seul coup, leur identité juive devient embarrassante. Ils voudraient bien se fondre dans la masse et ne plus être visibles en tant que juifs et tentent d'une manière ou d'une autre de se débarrasser de leur identité. Bien sûr, au milieu, il y a tout un ensemble de gens qui se posent des questions ou qui s'inquiètent. Mais je crois que ce qui est fondamental dans cette double démarche, c'est qu'elle est fondée sur une méconnaissance, sur une erreur, sur une mauvaise compréhension de ce que c'est que l'identité juive. Et notre vrai défi, c'est de faire en sorte que cette identité juive soit lisible, soit intéressante, donne du sens. Parce que ce que les jeunes recherchent avant tout, c'est du sens à leur vie. Alors on n'a jamais eu autant de cercles d'études, de cours dans la communauté juive en France, et je pense que dans le monde, quand on voit les publications en Israël, c'est impressionnant. Mais on agit essentiellement sur deux axes. Le premier, c'est celui de l'érudition. Malheureusement, on sait que ce n'est pas l'érudition qui fait l'homme de valeur, l'homme d'honneur. On peut être très cultivé et être un barbare. Donc l'érudition ne peut suffire. D'un autre côté, on investit beaucoup sur la connaissance de la pratique, ce qu'il faut faire dans la tradition juive, ce qu'il est correct de faire ou de ne pas faire. Ces deux éléments sont indispensables, mais complètement insuffisants. Ce n'est pas le savoir, ni intellectuel, ni pratique, qui forme l'homme. C'est sa pensée. Comment reprendre ces textes, leur donner du sens? Les extrémistes savent mettre en valeur des concepts tout simples, et ils les présentent comme étant des éléments fondamentaux qui révolutionnent le monde. On a la plus grande mine d'idées et de sens et de signification, et on ne l'ouvre pas suffisamment. On apprend des choses, on apprend comment faire, mais on n'apprend pas à penser comme en tant qu'homme. On n'apprend pas à se confronter soi-même au texte pour en faire sortir un sens qui renouvelle notre position de juif dans le XXIe siècle. C'est ça le défi, faire en sorte que le judaïsme devienne une identité adulte, c'est-à-dire responsable, pas simplement celui qui sait ce qui a été dit avant lui ou ce qui sait reproduire les actes de ses ancêtres, même si c'est fondamental. Et sans ça, on ne peut pas être juif. Mais avec ça, on n'est pas suffisamment juif aujourd'hui pour affronter le monde du XXIe siècle. C'est ce judaïsme adulte que nous devons tous construire ensemble, en tant que responsables éducatifs, en tant que responsables communautaires. Ne pas se satisfaire de la moyenne, ne pas se satisfaire de ce qui se fait aujourd'hui, parce que c'est insuffisant pour l'avenir.
Thank you, all 5 of you. That was fascinating. We are going to leave time if there are questions from the audience. Not yet. Just write your questions down. And hopefully we'll have time to entertain some questions from the audience. I'm going to move to the second question, which is a very difficult one, concerning Shoah education. How does this enrich or diminish one's Jewish identity? How do we balance this death and destruction and at the same time make our students proud to be Jewish? How do we talk about victimhood opposite Jewish creativity and strength? And this is probably the challenge, the main challenge that we have presented here during these 3 days of the conference, in incorporating the Shoah as part of our Jewish identity, but if I can say in a more positive, enriching, engaging way, which will make them proud to be Jewish. Stephen.
Thank you, Frank. First of all, I have to say I've been asked to talk about America, and so I'm very conscious of the fact, with my 4 distinguished panelists, that this question is very much a contextual question. Obviously, this question means something different in America than it might mean in Argentina or today in Paris or Australia. In America, we have largely interpreted the question of the Holocaust by adoption of American liberal values. And so we support liberal causes in the belief that that will head off any kind of tragedy. We would then interfere with the right to interfere, as the UN put it, which we don't do, as Erwin pointed out, in various places of genocide. So the American Jewish community has approached this as a problem of politics in some large way, as well as, of course, having a religious significance. We institute also the memory of the Holocaust as an American memory. Remember, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is on the Mall, the central part of Washington, and it gets about $100 million a year from the U.S. government. And that's a remarkable thing. But of course, in America also, we're in competition with a black identity because of the history of slavery, and now they've just opened a new slave museum right next door to the Holocaust Museum. We already have built about 15 years ago a Native American museum because of the history of Native Americans and the destruction of Native Americans in America. So the issue is very complicated in the American setting, partly by our political choices and partly by our historical experience. But I would say the important thing from the inside is that we have to convey when we teach the Holocaust that the student must not acquire some kind of sense of inferiority or shame, some loss of esteem. That seems to me to be absolutely essential. That when we teach about Einsatzgruppen, and we teach about death camps, or we teach about the various activities, we have to find ways, not only, of course, not to distort the element of the horror, but we have to emphasize something about the miraculous behavior of the Jews, the self-help programs in the general government, the Kiddush Hashem performed by the Orthodox, the Kol Yisrael Arayvim, the attitude of helping each other that Erwin mentioned, which is so important. We have to find ways to emphasize that amidst the darkness there was positive Jewish behavior, and the Jewish people actually were heroic. We have to teach the Jewish councils, not in the way Hannah Arendt would teach them, that the Jewish councils were responsible for the Holocaust, and without the councils we would have been better off, but that the councils are a complicated story, that there were heroes in the councils, Jacob Edelstein in Theresienstadt, Gens in Vilna, though perhaps more mixed, Chernyakov in Warsaw, Barash in Bialystok, Edkes, of course, in Kovna, that the Jewish people did some remarkable things, that the students therefore should come out of Holocaust education asking not only why was there so little resistance, but how could there have been so much? I think that's a crucial question. Also, I just would say that the object is not to make them historians. They hardly can read and write. The fact is that what we want to do is advance a Jewish identity. We want to situate Holocaust education, especially in those places where we control the educational curriculum, day schools, after-day schools, communal programs. We want to emphasize the connection with the larger Jewish historical experience. Remember the Passover Seder. Everybody should count themselves as if they came out of Egypt. The students have to be contextualized amidst a positive Jewish circumstance. They have to be taught the glory of studying the Rambam or the Zohar. They have to know something about the struggles for the creation of the Medina, the State of Israel. The positive Jewish experience is extremely important because what we're doing here is not trying to make them Holocaust conscious, we're trying to make Jews. So the Jewish experience is crucial to the totality of this, and it needs to be integrated in a fundamental way.
Thank you, Stephen. Vic.
Thank you. I'd like to make 3 points in response to this question. In Australia, there are many commonalities, similarities between the Jewish experience and the Aboriginal experience. Some years ago, one of the leaders of the Aboriginal community, his name is Noel Pearson, very highly respected individual, wrote a column in one of our national newspapers, The Australian, in which he urged the Aboriginal people to learn from the Jewish experience in 2 ways. One, he identified the fact that Jewish people hold on to, retain, preserve, embrace their distinctive culture, identity, and traditions, and at the same time get involved and achieve in civil society, in Supreme Courts, in universities, medicine, wherever it is. At the same time, he talked about genocide. Aboriginal people too have experienced a genocide. And again, he spoke about the importance which the Jewish people do of retaining and learning the lessons from the Holocaust and using it to positive effect and to extract education, etc. from that, but not to get subsumed by it and not to become lost in the victimhood which can go with that experience, as the Jewish people have done. And so that is the first point I'll make, that from his perspective, we are doing that effectively in both regards. My wife Nadine and I, she's in the audience today, on our way to Israel from Australia, we came via Greece. And we went first and foremost to Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki, as you would know, 95% of the 50,000 Jews of Thessaloniki were murdered. And they weren't murdered under cover of darkness. They were confined into ghettos in broad daylight. They were amassed in a Liberty Square, Eleftheria Square, where they had to do humiliating gymnastics and exercises in the blazing July sun. They walked through the streets of Thessaloniki to a final ghetto point and then to the trains and then to Auschwitz. We went from Thessaloniki to Zakynthos. And Zakynthos, and many of you will know this, had all of 275 Jews. And when the German forces arrived on Zakynthos, they went to the mayor, Lucas Carrere, and said, give us the names and addresses of the Jews here. And Mayor Lucas Carrere goes to see Bishop Chrysostomos and said, how do we do that? The Jews have been here for 500 years. They're as Greek as we are. And the bishop says, we will give them a list. And the two of them went to see the German commander the next day, handed him a piece of paper and said, here is your list. And on that piece of paper were 2 names, their own names. Bishop Lucas Carrere, Bishop Chrysostomos and Mayor Lucas Carrere. And at the same time, they had encouraged the ordinary folk, the villagers, to hide the Jews amongst themselves. Not one Jew on Zakynthos lost his or her life. So here we have on one extreme the epitome of evil and bystanders, and right at the other end of the spectrum the epitome of humanity and decency and principle. And to me, one of the most important points in having Shoah education be an enriching experience is emphasizing the fact that it was ordinary people who did what happened in Thessaloniki and what happened in Zakynthos. It was ordinary people, and Professor Carter did it brilliantly this morning, who were the pharmacists who determined how much Zyklon B should go into the gas chambers, and the IT specialists and the doctors and the railways masters, etc. It was the ordinary people at the same time who hid the Jews in Chambon-sur-Lignon and in Zakynthos and in Denmark and got them over the river. And that, if we emphasize that, that keeps the Holocaust relevant and makes it an enriching learning experience. And the final point I'll make quickly is that we need to focus on the universal lessons of the Holocaust. Yes, we retain the uniqueness of it, and the unique aspect of it, which is important, but equally, again, to make the learning of it a positive experience, to emphasize that the Holocaust, and again, Irvin Carter said it this morning, did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words, and it was a gradation of experiences from words to marginalization, to isolation, to demonization, so that when mass murder finally happened, it was the next logical point in a gradation of experiences. So if we emphasize that it was ordinary people, that there are universal lessons which derive from that, it makes it a positive learning experience.
Think of it. Marcelo.
Let me begin by reading a little story, very, very short, of an amazing book which is called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. Yafa Eliach wrote this. When Pharaoh restored the chief butler to his position, as foretold by Joseph in his interpretation of the butler's dream, he forgot Joseph. And the passage says, Velo yizkor שר המשקים את יוסף וישכחהו. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Why does the Bible use this repetitive language? It is obvious that if the butler forgot Joseph, he did not remember him. Yet, both verbs are used, remembering and forgetting. The Bible, in using this language, is teaching us a very important lesson, said the rabbi of Blusov, Rabbi Israel Spira, to his Hasidim. There are events of such overbearing magnitude that one ought not to remember them all the time, but one must not forget them either. Such an event is the Holocaust. And I use this story in order to think about the relationship between Jewish identity and the Holocaust, because in this balance we can shape our best investments in education in order to, to remember, but at the same time to not to cover all our Jewish identity, or most of it, as Rabbi Sachs said before, based on the definition that others made of ourselves. So when I entered here again this year, I remember of a piece of story about the beginning of Yad Vashem, and when, how was the name? Mordechai Shenavi, no? Mordechai Shenavi, in 1942, knowing the awful stories that he heard from Europe, especially from HaShomer HaTzair, he dreamt up of establishing a national kind of memorial here in Palestine at that moment for the Holocaust victims. And a rabbi, Moshe Burstein, suggested him to name after a pasuk, a verse of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, where I have it here because I think it's important to remember that, because we are in this place. It says in Hebrew, "Venatati laem bebeiti ubechomati yad vashem, tov mibanim umibanot, shem olam eten lo, asher lo ikaret." And in English, for the translators, "Even unto them will I give in my house and within my wall a place and a name, Yad Vashem, better than of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." And this was said to the, how do you say Sarisim in English? Sarisim in English? Eunuchs? Sarisim. Eunuchs. The ones that has cut off this.
Let's not go into detail.
Unix, okay, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Sarisim. Okay, Unix. In Spanish is eunucos. Okay, eunucos. Okay. So
It sounds better in
it
Spanish.
sounds better in Spanish. But it's important to know. No, it's important. I mean, to remember this because you know they are the ones that don't have any future because they don't have family. So in front of the death, naming this place Yad Vashem, I think that there are some hint of what we should do with the remembrance of the Holocaust. I mean, we have to put emphasis, stress on the Yad part, which is a monument, something tangible, you can touch it, you can build on that, maybe it's information, history, the data, but you don't have to forget the Shem part, which I connect to the Shem of Noah. And if you stress only the Shem part and you forget the other part, the Yad, you also you are lacking of something. So we need to balance in this form these two sides also of our identity and also of our memory of the Holocaust.
Thank you for the wonderful Midrashim. Thank you. Gracias. Rabbi Goren.
In Russia and Soviet Union, before the memory of war is one of the core sacral parts of the national idea. So the difference between the Soviet period and today is that Holocaust, Jewish victims and also the Jewish heroes of this war. I want to state that the war is called Russia 1941-1945, the Great Patriotic War. In terms of Holocaust, that's exactly the same time that Holocaust was done. So the Jewish part of the story wasn't told in the Soviet times. And now you see the very opposite thing because of the politics as well, because of the revisionism of the war in Eastern Europe, so-called problem between Stalin and Hitler. So the Jewish question for the Russian propaganda now, that war is a very core part of this discourse, because the Soviet army are the liberators of the camps, and that's beyond all the questions. So the Jewish memory in the war in Russia is also a little bit different from the memory, let's say, in Poland, Hungary, or Romania, because you are talking also about 500,000 Jewish soldiers in the Russian ranks. So, and you're talking about the heroic struggle of the very famous heroes of the war, and that's why this is sophisticated and complicated part of the question that Russian young Jews don't feel themselves as a part of the victims only, but also as a part of the country that brought Hitler and Nazis. As for the challenges, going back to our questions of the challenges of Holocaust is very similar to the challenge of the Russian propaganda memory about the war as well, because it's become in Russia the cult of memory of the war, the very scent, very secret memories that you can touch that, you can talk about that critically, about the faults of the government and so on. So that's the part of the religion, of the modern religion. And I think that in some cases it's very similar to the Holocaust memory in the Jewish people. That's the core point of the Jewish identity in Europe, in a lot of countries, and in Russia as well. So, as it was said before, anti-Semitism had his, and Soviet Union as well, had his positive so-called part where the Jews felt themselves the Jews because of the anti-Semitism. The same thing is Holocaust. The Holocaust, as a great Polish poet Ilan Tuwim had said, and the Yari Book of Russia said something very similar, had reminded a lot of Jews that they are Jews and they cannot be anymore not the sons of Hannah, as it was said by Aaron Book. He had remembered, Hitler had reminded him that his mother's name was Hannah. So, but that's only if we are talking about the modern times, that's only halfway. And I think that the challenge and the part to work with that is to try to find something deeper in that historical experience, as well as the historical experience of the anti-Semitism as well. That the young generation shall understand that today not to be Jew, that's to give the victory to Hitler. That's what he wanted to see, the Europe without Jews, Walter without Jews. So to be Jew today is not only to go to Auschwitz, to the march of the life march, the march of living, but also to be on the march in your communities. So we in Russia, in Moscow, in our museum as well, we are trying to find, to use, as it can be heard, cynic, to use these sentiments of the Holocaust as an understanding that the duty of the young generation is to be in that chain of the people that were murdered because of their Jewishness, so not to be traitors, to remind Jews. And I think that it works. And it works in the publishing, it works in the museums. We have in our Jewish museum and Colon Center in Moscow, the main place, I would say the half of all the museum is the part of the Great Patriotic War, not only the Holocaust, because of the things that I said before. So, and visiting there is very emotional from our part, the lectures and the movies that they see. But we see, we have an evidence of something a little bit deeper. People understand it, kids understand, children understand, students understand that their connection to the Jewish people is something more than only the genes, the gens, only their natural part of the Jewish people, but also as the part of the people who were murdered. And so that's the challenge, not to give up, not to give up all of the Jewish identity only to the Holocaust memory, but that's also the chance to continue the Jewishness because of the Holocaust memories. And I think that it depends on us. The memory of Holocaust is the matter of fact. And whatever we can say about that, even the people who don't want to hear more about the Holocaust, the Jews who are tired of Holocaust movies and the camps and the books of Holocaust and don't want to read that, don't want to see that, that's also don't want that, they think about that. That's the core part of their identity, also of, to be out of that, but to be out of that, that's very core in their part. So that's a matter of fact. Our part is to try to do something with that. Not only to teach about Holocaust, because it's the case in Russia, because people know a lot about that, about the war, and that's, as I said, part of the national idea, but try to find the lessons of the Holocaust to future, not only to the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Patrick.
On ne peut pas se passer aujourd'hui de l'enseignement de l'histoire de la Shoah. Ça fait partie de la nouvelle donne de l'identité de l'humanité et de l'identité du juif. Donc cette transmission, sous forme de faits, de description de ce qui a pu se passer, est indispensable. C'est normal qu'on ait commencé par ça. Lorsqu'on va sur une scène de crime, on commence d'abord par se poser la question de comment les choses se sont passées. Mais ensuite, il ne faut pas s'arrêter là dans la transmission de l'histoire de la Shoah. Parce que sinon, ce serait se priver de toutes les étincelles d'humanité qui se sont produites à un moment ou à un autre. Ces étincelles d'humanité, ce sont ces résistances physiques, spirituelles, parfois simplement de solidarité humaine, qui font qu'on a aussi un message positif à retirer de l'histoire de la Shoah. On peut apprendre de l'histoire de la Shoah comment des hommes appartenant à une haute culture peuvent devenir des bourreaux. Parce que on a toujours la question, est-ce que ça aurait pu être nous? Mais en même temps, on doit se poser la deuxième question. Comment dans des situations limites, comme celles qu'ils ont pu vivre pendant la Shoah, au moment de la destruction, au moment de la déshumanisation, comment dans cette situation extrême qu'on a du mal même à imaginer parce qu'on ne l'a pas vécu, comment dans cette situation-là on peut rester un homme? Comment on peut garder une dimension d'humanité qui nous permet de résister à l'intérieur de nous-mêmes contre cette barbarie extrême? Il y a un temps pour le deuil. Il y a un temps pour le souvenir des disparus. Mais à travers le souvenir des disparus, il doit y avoir aussi le souvenir de l'action positive de ces disparus. Parce que ce souvenir-là, c'est ce qui nous permet à nous d'améliorer encore notre identité. Comment on vivrait ce qui nous Hachem si on y était? On a une situation humaine difficile aujourd'hui, après la Shoah. On sait que n'importe quel homme, du fait d'un endoctrinement systématique, peut oublier son humanité. Mais on sait aussi que ce même homme, dans les pires situations, peut, de manière infime, pour ça que je parle d'étincelle, rester un homme. Après la Shoah, on ne peut plus concevoir l'intervention de Dieu dans l'histoire exactement comme on le faisait avant. On est obligé de changer notre perception. On ne change pas Dieu, c'est simplement notre compréhension qui change. Il est indispensable qu'on change aussi notre perception de l'humain. Parce que cette responsabilité de pouvoir devenir le pire des bourreaux ou le plus grand des tzaddiks dans un instant fugace mais fondamentale, elle est sur nos épaules aujourd'hui.
Hey, thank you, all five of you. That was fascinating. The answers, they were fascinating. In each of your communities, it's very clear there are different challenges. It could be in Russia, in France, Latin America, as you mentioned, big in Australia, and the United States. And the last big question is a big one. Prepare. What do you think, each and every one of you, will be the memory of the Shoah in another 2 generations, another 50 years? Where do you think it's going? Will we still remember it? Please.
That's a difficult question. It's always very difficult to predict the future. You know, in Russia, in the time of Stalin, they used to ask questions about the future of Russia, and the Russian historians used to say, it's hard enough to predict the past, because every time Stalin changes his mind, we have to rewrite the great encyclopedia. And in Mao's China, they asked Mao what he thought of the French Revolution 200 years after the event. He said it's too soon to tell. So predicting the future is not simple. Also in my own lifetime, the lifetime of all of us here, I'm reminded of the facts on the ground, how much they've changed. Sergio Della Pergola mentioned that 5% intermarriage rate in 1960, and now 50 years later, 72%. That's extraordinary in really essentially my lifetime. Also, we've had such a change in the political order. When I was growing up, no one ever thought that Lieberman could run for vice president of the United States. Also, in the United States, you can't run for president unless you have a Jewish son-in-law, right? So Gore has a Jewish son-in-law, Hillary has a Jewish son-in-law, Trump, who's going to make America great again, has a Jewish son-in-law, and she's actually a convert, very sincere. They send their children to Jewish schools. And even the Kennedys have a Jewish son-in-law, Schlossberg. And that's a wonderful thing because it means that Joe Kennedy, who was really a mamzer, turns in his grave continually. So I'm a little cautious about this prediction. Also, I'm aware of perspective. As I said, everything is perspectival. I go teach in China every couple of years, and they're wonderful and they're very respectful, and no matter what you talk about the Rambam, you talk about the Zohar, the first question is, why are Jews so rich? Second question is, why are Jews so smart? But they mean it sympathetically. And so they've created all over the world Confucian centers, because they know Chinese have to have a culture after Maoism. What is the culture? It's Neo-Confucianism. What is the model of Neo-Confucianism? American Reform Judaism. Doesn't have much of a future. So the fact is that this phenomenon of perspective is very important. But I would say the following. In 2 generations, 3 generations, we can be sure there will be Holocaust studies. And the reason is the American Jewish community has done an extraordinary job of institutionalizing Holocaust memory. First of all, we have these very considerable museums. I mentioned Washington, which gets 2 million people a year, almost none of them Jews. School groups from Texas, Iowa, they all come up to Washington on their school trips, and they go to the museum. We have a Holocaust museum, Museum of Tolerance in LA. We have a museum in Washington, in Texas. We have a museum in Florida. In addition, we've done a really remarkable job of institutionalizing in universities. There are many that don't have Holocaust studies, as I recently found out from someone, but hundreds and hundreds of colleges have Holocaust studies, and not that they have them on soft money, they have them on endowed money, which means that it's not a whim that the dean will change and the subject will change to teaching about Rwanda or something else. So we've really institutionalized the memory, and that's a very significant thing. However, in light of what I said before, the decline in the population, if we think of a declining population, this memory will be carried increasingly, as it is today, by non-Jews. When you go to the Holocaust Museum, they tell you, if you're a witness of a witness, you become a witness. So the significance is changing. The object will be to make the lessons of the Shoah existential lessons, not merely historical lessons. The one very complicated, what should I say, shadow, cloud on the horizon that may seem a little bit arcane to many of you is this. We are now in a very, very serious confrontation in the academic community, which spills over into the larger community over the issue of genocide studies. Genocide studies grew up out of Holocaust studies, and what has happened is it now emphasizes everything is a genocide. There are authentic comparisons, like in Rwanda, there are inauthentic comparisons, but everything has become a genocide. If everything is a genocide, nothing is a genocide. So the whole idea of the Holocaust as a distinctive, a unique tragedy, which has peculiar characteristics, as the only tragedy in history where a population was assaulted so that every man, woman, and child would become exterminated, that has become subject to great debate, and we're losing the battle, I'm afraid to say. We're losing the battle in that regard. And so it's a very complicated issue of how we're going to go forward to really keep something of the authenticity of the Shoah. Someone here said, I forget who it was, I apologize, I think it was the first day, that the Shoah was not a war of humanity against humanity, but a war of humanity against the Jews. The Shoah represents something very distinctive. Until now, we've emphasized that in the Holocaust education with success, but now we're losing the battle to genocide studies, and that may well have an enormous implication for what happens in classrooms and then in our culture, and the way people perceive the Holocaust vis-a-vis issues of relativizing, issues of breadth and universalization and so on, which all have considerable implications for the Jewish community and the way we see the Shoah.
In terms of the immediate Australian experience, we have been successful in having Holocaust education as a mandatory part of the education syllabus in public schools throughout the country, taught to a greater or lesser extent. And we have world-class Holocaust museums in Sydney and Melbourne, which is where the bulk of the community resides, although there are significant Jewish populations in the areas such as Perth and other cities. In the broader context, however, to answer the question of where do we see memory in another 2 generations, I believe that it will become increasingly important, and is already increasingly important, to reflect the Jewish experience and the Holocaust experience through a wider lens. We see this, for example, at the Anne Frank House, where there are panels which talk about the importance of respect for different cultures and bigotry and discrimination in a purest sense, and not specifically about the Holocaust. The Sydney Jewish Museum has begun a program called Beyond Bias. And this is a program which they take into civil society. So they will approach major companies like Coca-Cola or IBM and the academic world. And they will offer to bring up this program called Beyond Bias for members of that particular organization, the corporate world. And it's a program which focuses on, it's not about the Holocaust, but it focuses on, it makes the point that it's human to be inhumane, and that we all have biases, whether for or against people, friend or foe, when we meet them. When we meet strangers, we all have innate biases. So the instinctive response from those taking the program is, but our biases will never lead to a genocide, which then opens the door to the Holocaust, and to make the point, which we've discussed earlier on this panel, that it was ordinary people who did these things and ordinary people who said no. And so it's a very powerful program. It runs for 3 hours at a time. And there's an increasing level of uptake by major corporates in Sydney, Australia. Moving on, obviously museums and places like Yad Vashem, museums around the world will continually update and become increasingly digitalized, and the conveying of the message will have to take on a more digital forum and vehicle, certainly given the decreasing amount of attention span which future generations have, given all the competing interests. That said, we will also see, and it is inevitable, that we will have to rely, while we will have important forums like this, and rely on museums and academia and the world of academics and scholarship, it will also be increasingly important to rely on such forums as art and theatre and unconventional means of getting the message across. Now, many of you will have seen about 3 weeks ago, there was a very controversial issue. In Russia, there was an ice skating competition on television, which was nationally broadcast. And one pair of skaters in this competition chose to skate wearing striped uniform with a yellow star, and to do in their artistic expression to convey the Holocaust. Now, there was a predictable upsurge of horror from people around the world, including the very eminent Deborah Lipstadt, who said this is ultimate in tastelessness, etc. I'm certainly not arguing for what took place, but I'm raising it with a question mark attached to it. Is this the sort of vehicle which we will need to entertain going forward? Not that one can control these things. I mean, this couple did this. The choreographer was in fact Israeli. The music was the music from Life is Beautiful, which we know is not a highly regarded movie at all. Nevertheless, it does raise the question about the vehicles and the forums in which Holocaust education and memory and message will be in two generations' time.
Thank you, Vic. Marcelo.
Allow me to a little Mishnah we've done תורה שבכתב, עכשיו נעבור לתורה
Rabbi,
שבעל
we
פה.
are listening.
I'm sorry, I'm a rabbi.
You don't have to. No one's perfect.
Okay, no, it's perfect. You're right, you're right. I agree with you 100%. Several years ago, I studied a little Mishnah with Rabbi Martin Cohen, and it's taken from Masechet Ohalot, and it says like this. It's related to a concept which is שדה בוכים. מה זה שדה בוכים? שדה בוכים זה שטח... Again to English. שדה בוכים, it's a piece of land. שדה בוכים, it's a field of tears, but it's a piece of land which is adjacent to a cemetery where they used to give a eulogy for the bereaved and then the levaya, okay? And the discussion, the halachic discussion here is related to the purity or impurity of this piece of land. So there are a lot of arguments, and finally they reach this conclusion. שדה בוכים לא ניתת ולא נזרט, בהפרת האור ועושים ממנה תנורים לקודש. In English now, one may neither plant nor seed a שדה בוכים, a field of tears, but the soil itself of such a field is nonetheless regarded as pure, taor. Therefore, mud ovens may be made of such soil even for holy use. And I bring this Mishnah here in order to answer your question. I think that if we see the Holocaust in any way as a kind of שדה בוכים, of a field of tears, we should turn it to a holy place. And I imagine in 50 years from now that if we manage to make the remembrance of the Holocaust as holy as, for example, we have made the remembrance of the destruction of the first and second temple, we will succeed in this. And how we did that? We made a ritual. For example, we fast. I was very happy the other day on Monday when I met Dr. Eyal Kaminka. I told him that I fast on each Yom HaShoah. It's a personal thing. And he said that he does the same thing. And I was shocked, because I think that besides all the stuff of the last discussion of Asara B'Tevet, 10th of Tevet and all that, I think that we need to make a new ritual of the Holocaust in order to remember it. Look at this. In each of our chupot, our marriage ceremonies, we break the cup in order to remember the destructions of the first and second temple. I would love to have in each bar mitzvah, from now on, that each bar mitzvah could use an aliyah, for example, for remember one child that perished in the Holocaust. And that would lead to, imagine a program made here in Yad Vashem. I know that in some places they used to do that, but I would recommend that, humbly, that the authorities of Yad Vashem could develop a program for making it, globally. I'm sorry? Okay. Of making each bar mitzvah a part of a remembrance of a child died in the Holocaust. And I don't know how, but we need to make it holy. We need to make it holy. And in that shape, I think that we will succeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Bo.
It's actually not a question that when the witnesses are gone, the memory of Holocaust and memory of war will be very different, because I remember the war and the Holocaust because of the stories that I heard from my grandfather's grandmother, and it's very different from reading about Holocaust and even watching the movie about Holocaust. even a documentary about the Holocaust. That's why it's so important, the work that Shoah Association of Steven Spielberg and Yad Vashem is doing, and our museum is in partnership with that. They take the witnessing, the evidence of the Holocaust of the people who managed it. The thing is that when the witnesses are gone, the memory will be, and is already now, not only very different, sometimes very vulgarized, and as it was mentioned, every opponent is called SS member, and every party that's not yours is National Socialist Party of Hitler, and so on, and that's boring, I will say. And that's why the memory of Holocaust, the memory of war, became more and more vulgarized, and that's the biggest problem that I see in that. It was mentioned now the political part of that, about, let's say, the story that was said here about the competition in Russian television a month ago. The small but very important detail. The leader of this pair was the wife of Russian President Mr. Putin, press secretary. So I believe that that's what the main.
That's an important detail.
And I believe that this detail made the issue. And that's what we will see more and more, when the details that are not touched with the Holocaust per se will be more important than the Holocaust theme in that. So I believe that the Holocaust memory, Holocaust studies for sure will be preserved, will be continued, and in our country, in Russia, I want to repeat, we see the increasing of the interest in that because of the silence of the decades in the Soviet era. So that's why now, let's say Yom HaShoah, that is 27 January in Europe, the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, we are doing in our museum the so-called memory ceremony for the ambassadors of the different countries. So one time this ceremony was visited by Mr. President Putin, second time by Prime Minister Medvedev. You see that they see the importance to mention that because of the political part of that. We see that one country that was very united in the memory of Holocaust is divided for the very different approach as the country had divided. The Soviet Union became 15 different republics, different countries, and we see as the memory of the Holocaust, the things that were in the human memory, not only in the propaganda memory, that is well documented and so on, is very challenging now in Ukraine, in Lithuania, in Estonia, in Latvia, and in the countries that were out of the Soviet Union, like Hungary, Romania, even Poland. And in that case, Russia sees itself as the defender of the memory. And that's the very not so simple question, because on one part, it's for sure that the political agenda uses the theme of Holocaust, let's say, in the propaganda against Ukraine. And in the second hand, you see that in the majority of the cases, it's true. As Mr. Putin had said about the hackings of the Democratic Party documents, there's no difference who hacked them. The core issue is what was there. So the same thing when Russian propaganda uses the revisionism of the Holocaust in the post-Soviet countries as the tool against them, that's an important part of that, the important detail, as it was said. But it doesn't change the attitude that the things are very, very dangerous in the memory of the Holocaust in the post-Soviet countries. And I think that we'll live between these two challenges. And it's very important for us not to be used on one hand and to preserve the memory of the Holocaust per se as it. But on the other part, to understand that we have the very a lot of new opportunities. That, let's say that our museum that more than 1 million people had visited that in the last 4 years. It was based by the Federation of Jewish Communities Russia with the help of the government, and the help was very heavy. So the visitor have to decide, is it seen in the exhibition, can he see the hands of Kremlin in there, or he can't see the hands of Kremlin in there? And that will be the answer about the challenges of the Holocaust memorization in such countries as Russia and different other countries as Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, and Romania. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Patrick.
Merci. La connaissance historique n'est pas suffisante pour que ça devienne une mémoire. On le sait, de commémoration en commémoration, les faits s'oublient et progressivement la population ne sait plus ce qui s'est passé. Parce que la mémoire, elle a besoin que ce souvenir, cette histoire, elle soit portée par des hommes. Elle soit rendue vivante par des hommes. Il est indispensable de développer la recherche historique, mais c'est pas ça qui va faire qu'on se souviendra des massacres des Juifs au Moyen-Âge, ou des victimes de l'Inquisition, ou même de celles des pogroms de Kishinev. Tant qu'on a des témoins oculaires, on a une présence vivante. Surtout lorsqu'ils ont pris le soin, de plus en plus aujourd'hui, de transmettre un message, alors on aura quelque chose. On aura des livres, on aura des films lorsqu'ils ne seront plus là, on aura un potentiel de témoignage irremplaçable. Mais la question qui se pose, c'est qu'est-ce qui va motiver nos petits-enfants à ouvrir ces livres, à visionner ces documents? Parce que le fait qu'ils soient là n'est pas suffisant. S'ils ont le sentiment que ça n'apporte rien à leur quotidien, alors on aura de bonnes archives, mais ce n'est pas la mémoire de la Shoah qu'on pourrait espérer. Et l'espérer, pas juste parce que ça nous ferait plaisir, mais parce qu'on a le sentiment qu'il y a là quelque chose d'exceptionnel et qu'il ne faudrait pas ne pas être au rendez-vous de cette histoire. Si on se souvient de la sortie d'Égypte, c'est pas pour savoir que nos ancêtres étaient esclaves et comment ils étaient esclaves et comment l'esclavage a pu se mettre en place. Bien sûr, ça fait partie de l'enseignement, mais c'est pas ça la cause essentielle. On se souvient de l'esclavage en Égypte pour apprendre comment ne pas se comporter vis-à-vis de quelqu'un d'autre. Comment ne pas l'opprimer, comment ne pas le déshumaniser, comment ne pas en faire un objet qu'on peut jeter lorsqu'on n'en a plus d'utilité. Donc on apprend une histoire pour en tirer un message positif. On a besoin de tout le cadre historique de cette histoire. Mais on a besoin que ce message reste vivant et d'avoir le sentiment que de cette histoire, on a quelque chose qui vient nous apprendre aujourd'hui, nous transformer, nous éduquer. Il faut qu'avec la mémoire de la Shoah, on arrive à cette même démarche, cette même révolution conceptuelle, de faire en sorte que sur toute la base de ce que l'on a aujourd'hui, on en sorte un message fondamental pour construire notre identité, différemment de celle des générations précédentes. Pas une identité larmoyante, parce qu'on l'a bien vu, il n'y a pas eu que des gens dociles, et même dans ceux qui apparaissaient comme dociles, on a bien vu qu'il y avait des résistances et une humanité extrême qui s'est exprimée au moment où on ne l'attendait plus et au moment où les bourreaux l'attendaient le moins. Mais il faut qu'on trouve, en transmettant cette histoire avec ses faits, avec ses drames, une dimension supplémentaire qui fasse que dans 50 ans, ce sera encore un sujet d'intérêt et une source d'enrichissement pour nos petits-enfants ou arrière-petits-enfants. C'est vrai que l'une des manières de le faire, c'est cette ritualisation. Il y a plusieurs initiatives qui ont été faites. Je voudrais rappeler juste celle qui me vient à l'esprit à l'instant, qui a été faite vraiment juste dans l'après-guerre. La rédaction par le professeur André Neher, grand penseur français qui a été caché pendant la Shoah, qui a rédigé des keynotes de Tisha B'Av. Des keynotes spécifiques. Comme à Tisha B'Av, on a encore des chants qui nous rappellent les drames du Moyen-Âge et les Hakedot du Moyen-Âge, où nos enfants n'ont pas pu être sauvés comme l'a pu être Yitzhak. Alors il y a ces tentatives. Il y a une autre tentative qui a été faite par la mouvance libérale en France de rédiger une sorte de Haggadah pour le Yom HaShoah. Ce sont des choses importantes, mais ce n'est pas suffisant si on ne fait pas émerger de manière plus intense encore le message d'humanité. Comment ces récits, ces témoignages vont nous apprendre à être un humain encore meilleur demain. Si on réussit ça, alors c'est pas dans 50 ans qu'on aura la mémoire, mais c'est pour de très nombreuses années encore après.
I'd like to thank Stephen, Vic, Marcelo, Bo, and Patrick for an amazing, inspiring, and very informative. You are all prophets in different ways from different places, and we will take your words to heart, and thank you very much for participating in this panel today.